children now, 7, 4, and the 11-month, 3 children. Not a ton of
3.
time for
Okay.
haikus these days. Such a pleasure to be with you all, to be back with you all. I know it's been a while, but I'm very much looking forward to this. I'm Avi Strausberg. And yes, in addition to heading up the learning, bringing Hadar's learning and programming to DC, since we last spoke, we are now also bringing learning and programming. We have on-ground faculty in Boston and Chicago as well, if you happen to be in one of those cities. And soon next year, we're actually hiring someone to start to be on the ground faculty in LA. We're finally getting to California. So that might actually have some impact on you all. So we're really excited about that. I'm particularly excited about the learning that we're going to be doing today. We're really going to be focusing on stories. As Ari said, the sort of heading of this series is rabbis behaving badly. Often, I think when you think about Jewish tradition, you think about holding up the rabbis as moral exemplars. We want to learn from their behavior. They are righteous people. We want to be righteous like them. We want to walk in God's way, follow their example. That's not what this series is. This is a series in which we're really uplifting some of the stories in which we see that the rabbis are human beings. They are struggling to make sense of the world. They are struggling to be good people just like us. They're just like the rest of us. And I would say that the focus of this is not to learn from what the rabbis, not to emulate the rabbis by learning from what they do, but rather to learn sometimes from what they don't do, to not to be like them by doing what they do, but to not be like them and have that be our sort of our moral compass, that sometimes we want to learn from their mistakes so that we are not making them ourselves. That's sort of the first thing. The second thing that I want to take note of is, a lot of the themes that we're going to be seeing, we could have gotten them from some other Jewish form of literature. We could have studied a halachic book. We could have studied a legal code that would have said we should behave such and such a way. Or we could have studied from the world of Musar, the world of Jewish ethics that would tell us what kind of person that we want to be in this world. We could have learned from the Torah, but we are specifically choosing in our time together to focus on the world of stories, to focus on the world of agadah. And I want to say a note about that. I think the first thing I want to say, being a parent of 3 small kids, is I see how much my children like stories. It starts at a very, very young baby age. There's something really just intuitive about wanting to learn about the world and process the world through stories. And I think that really continues on into adulthood. So while we could have gotten some of these same messages through Jewish ethics, through Musar, through halakha, through Jewish legal texts, there's something special about getting these in sort of a roundabout way through the world of agadah, through the world of story. So I want to come back to, in this course, what does it mean to be learning these themes, specifically through stories? Why stories? Why not something else? The third thing that I just want to note, there's something a little bit when Ari suggested that we make shirts that we wear around on the chagim, on the high holidays that say rabbis behaving badly. There's something obviously sensational about the course title on purpose. Rabbis behaving badly, like rabbis gone wild. There's something that's like, I don't know, is it problematic to be highlighting the mistakes of the rabbis or to be like waving them about on the flag? Well, those rabbis, whatever it is. But I think the thing that I want to draw our focus to is we are not the ones that are choosing to highlight those stories and say, wow, look at those rabbis behaving badly. Actually, the rabbis themselves chose to highlight those stories. The rabbis could have chosen to hide those stories in the background. They could have chosen to say, yeah, we are righteous, follow our example, we never make mistakes, you should act like us. And instead, you're going to see story after story in which really the rabbis are behaving very badly. And instead of hiding those stories, the rabbis are choosing to bring those to the forefront to say, actually, we are human too. We have the same weaknesses, the same struggles as the rest of you. And we're willing to sort of in humility, make ourselves vulnerable and say, let's learn from our mistakes together. So I think even before we get into the stories, there's something very profound about the fact that the rabbis are choosing to include these stories in Jewish tradition rather than excluding them. And that's another theme that I think we could come back to, of what does it mean that the rabbis actually are holding the things that they are holding up is not putting themselves on a moral pedestal, but saying, actually, look at us making mistakes. What can we all learn from this? In terms of our arc of our 3 sessions together, as I already said, today we're going to be looking at the lure of temptation, specifically looking at stories around the yetzer hara, the evil inclination. So we'll come back to that in a second. In our next session, we're going to be looking at what do we do when we make mistakes? And our 3rd session, we're going to be looking at what do we do when we are looking to seek forgiveness? What is the right way to be asking forgiveness? You'll see that these themes are obviously all very timely as we are approaching Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, as we are thinking in our own lives about what do we do when we make mistakes? How do we seek forgiveness? How do we sort of respond to other people seeking our forgiveness? We're going to be seeing the rabbis wrestle with these very same questions. Okay. We're finally ready to dive into our stories today. We have a packed 1 hour in front of us. So today we're going to be specifically looking at stories about the yetzer hara. We're going to be looking at 3 stories that all come back to back in Masechet Kiddushin, in the Talmud, in the tractate that's focused on Kiddushin, which is specifically marriage. The stories are not necessarily about marriage, but that is the title of the tractate, Kiddushin. So the stories come back to back. And they're all stories involving the evil inclination, the yetzer hara. So normally when the rabbis think about the yetzer hara, loosely just directly translated yetzer hara as evil inclination. It could be anything that sort of pulls us or tempts us to do something that is not good behavior or not what we want to be doing. So you could say, for example, Adam and Eve eating of the forbidden fruit in the garden, that was the yetzer hara that was tempting them, right? It was some sort of evil inclination. They knew what they needed to do, and there was actually something that was like pulling them to act against their better judgment, to act against God's judgment, and that was the yetzer hara, something that pulls them in the opposite direction. Oftentimes, when the rabbis are talking about the yetzer hara, they mean it in a more specific way. They mean it in sort of an evil inclination, specifically around like sexual temptation or inappropriate sexual relationships. So all 3 of the stories that we're going to be looking at today are really narrowly, we're gonna be talking about the yetzer hara, but it's really going to be the yetzer hara as we understand it about that temptation, sort of that sexual temptation. And the other thing that I just want to note about these stories is oftentimes when the rabbis talk about the yetzer hara, the yetzer hara meaning sort of like sexual temptation, they assume that this is the thing that they're really focusing on men, as being like men are really tempted by the yetzer hara. It's more of like a problem for men and less of a problem for women. I think that we probably all know that that's not necessarily true. But the rabbis, you're going to say, we're going to be looking at 3 stories in which the rabbis are really focusing on the yetzer hara as it relates to the men in these stories. So that's something that I think we can also bring into our conversations of what does it mean that the rabbis are really focused only on men? How do we take these lessons and really apply it to everyone, regardless of gender? The last thing I just want to say by word of introduction is, while these stories are really focusing narrowly on sexual temptation, what do we do when we are confronted with sexual temptation? What are different strategies that the rabbis try and either succeed or fail at, and what can we learn from that? I'm going to suggest that we also read these stories more expansively, not just to be about yetzer hara, not just to be about sexual temptation, but really, what do we do when we are pulled in a wrong direction? When we feel ourselves like sort of, rather than doing the thing that we know is right, doing something that maybe we know is not so good for us or not so good for other people, we're sort of pulled in a direction of weakness. Temptation, that temptation can lead us towards all sorts of different things. What might we try in the face of that? So again, while these stories are really talking about yetzer hara in a very narrow definition, I think we can, for our own selves and our learning, read it more expansively. What do we do when we are tempted to do wrong, when we are pulled from the right path, whatever that right path is for us, when we sort of feel like we're being faced with weakness? What are the strategies? What should we try? What should we not try? And we can think about all of that through the lens of the rabbis. Last thing I'll just say, we'll be a little bit in a frontal mode, all screen share. Arya, I don't know if you've already given me screen sharing, amazing. So I'll screen share and walk us through some of the stories, but then I'm absolutely, after we go through each story, I'm going to turn to the chat because I want to hear your thoughts and your responses in the chat there. So please do get ready to share what you're thinking. Okay, without further ado, we're going to go ahead and I will screen share our text. And I know that Ari has already dropped the link to the text in the chat. Okay, I'll make this a bit bigger. Okay, so if you're looking at the source sheet, we're actually going to start with the second source and then come back to the first source. They're not actually labeled, but you'll see them in boxes. So we're going to start on, it looks like it's the second page with Rabbi Meir, and then we'll jump back up. So you're going to see, we're, again, just reminding you, we're in Tractate Kiddushin, and we're going to see two short stories back to back, beginning with the story about Rabbi Meir. Just a word about Rabbi Meir before we start. Rabbi Meir, one of the great rabbis in his generation. He was a Tana in the days of 0 to 200 CE, so in the time period of the Mishnah. So one of the rabbis, sort of the greatest standing, a really great reputation, and that's who's being presented in this story. Rabbi Meir hava mitlotzet be'ovrei avera. Rabbi Meir would scorn and he would mock people who were transgressors. Just want to pause there. That's already a really interesting start to a story, isn't it? This is a rabbi who we want to hold up as a moral exemplar. And what is he doing? He's laughing at and he's mocking people who transgress. Okay, you might imagine that a rabbi might have all sorts of things to say about people who were sinning, right? That he might have thoughts about how to bring them back to the right path, but there's something that feels really problematic, that the thing he was doing was not supporting them or encouraging them or teaching them or, making time for them, that the thing that he's doing is mitlotzet. The thing that he's doing is mocking them and scorning them. And this coming from one of the greatest rabbis of his generation. So that already feels really interesting. Rabbi Meir hava mitlotzet v'ovrei avera. He would mock people who sinned. Okay. One day, Satan appeared to him as a woman on the other side of the river. So in case this is the first time that you were encountering Satan in Jewish texts, we do have our own Satan. You might have thought that that was unique to Christianity, but actually we have, it's like literally in the Hebrew, you can see it's Satan. We have this Satan figure in Jewish texts and Jewish stories that oftentimes works at ends, like sort of it's obviously sort of working against God in the text, but oftentimes it's Satan, it's Satan, that's sort of representative of the evil inclination of the yetzer hara, who was trying to lead people astray. And so here we have Yom Echad idmele Satan ke'itata. We have Satan appearing to Rabbi Meir in the form of a woman standing on the other side of the river. What happens? Since there was no ferry, Rabbi Meir took hold of a rope bridge and he crossed the river. What's implied here is that Rabbi Meir, who is mocking other people who go astray, the minute he's faced with temptation, he sees a beautiful woman on the other side of the river. What does he do? There's no ferry to get across. So he uses some sort of rope bridge. I'm imagining that this is like a tenuous, difficult bridge to cross the river. He gets it. He's like, well, there's no ferry. I have to get across somehow. He managed to transgress. And also, if you're thinking about it, it's so interesting, right? He makes fun of ovrei avera, of people who cross sin, and people who transgress. And what does he do? He transgresses himself. He crosses the river. He becomes the over avera. He becomes the transgressor himself, because metaphorically, he's using this rope bridge to cross the river to get to this woman on the other side, which is Satan. When he reached halfway across the rope bridge, the Satan, the yetzer hara, left him and said to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaim about you in heaven, be careful with regard to Rabbi Meir and his Torah, I would have made your blood like two ma'eh. like 2 ma'e, which is to say this 2 very small amounts of currency. I would have made your blood worthless. What is the story? Rabbi Meir, we know, apparently was a mocker of people who sin, right? People who are weak, who are vulnerable, who transgress, rather than helping them, he's laughing at them. And yet Satan wants to prove a point. So he dresses up, he sort of appears as a woman. And as soon as Rabbi Meir, he's faced with temptation, he tries to get across the river. He's halfway across. Satan, the yetzer hara, then leaves him. So he no longer has that inclination. Suddenly he stops. And Satan says, you're lucky, because were it not for the fact that they were saying about in heaven to watch out for your Torah and to protect you, I could have had you like that. I had you. You were on your way to me. Okay, second story. Rabbi Akiva, how they meet Avera. Also, so to Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis of his generation. There are so many stories about Rabbi Akiva, his righteousness, who started learning at the age of 40, the ways in which we should emulate and be like Rabbi Akiva. Any story that's about people coming to learning late in life, it's a story focusing on Rabbi Akiva and his nobility. What else do we know about Rabbi Akiva? He would mock and scorn people who sinned, people who transgressed. One day, Satan appeared to him as a woman at the top of a palm tree, right? It's always the Satan is appearing as a woman, something, this form of temptation, but there's like this distance that they have to get to this other side. What does Rabbi Akiva do? He grabs hold of the palm tree and began climbing. I must get there. I must get there. Here's this guy who a second ago, he was making fun of people for not being strong enough themselves. But then as soon as he's faced with temptation, he has no control over himself. When he was halfway up the palm tree, the yetzer hara left him. He no longer has the inclination and said to him, were it not for the fact that they proclaim about you in heaven, be careful with regard to Rabbi Akiva and his Torah, I would have made your blood like 2 ma'e. Again, same thing. You are lucky. I could have had you. I see that you who made fun of other people, as soon as you were faced with me in the form of a woman, your yetzer hara, your evil inclination took hold of you. You were on your way to me. And it's only because I chose to listen to that voice calling out that I didn't take you, but I could have had you. Okay, so these are 2 stories that I've said. We're going to look at, this is all one story unit. I'm calling this one story unit. We're going to look at 3 different stories. This is the first story that we're looking at, where I'm going to suggest we're seeing different rabbis relating to the yetzer hara, relating to their evil inclination. My question here is, how do you see Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva relating to the yetzer hara in this story? And to what extent are they successful or not successful in the way in which they are relating to it? So that's the first question. How are they relating to it? And are they successful or not successful? And then the second question is, what do you think this set of stories is trying to teach us about how we relate to our own yetzer hara, our own inclination? And again, I want us to read this text not just as being yetzer hara narrowly about sexual temptation, but really yetzer hara in general as like things that are leading us away from the path we know to be correct. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and turn to the chat now.
So we'll give people a moment to chat, and I'll ask you 2 questions that have come up. One is the word mitlotzetz, that I really haven't come across it too often. Is that unique to these stories, or is that a term you'd find other places in the Talmud? And the second question was about tarte mai, whether that measurement is also something that is common or unique.
That's a good question. In terms of mitlotzetz, no, I don't think that's particularly unique to these stories. There's a modern Hebrew word leitzan, which is connected to the same root mitlotzetz, and a leitzan is a clown. So I don't, I can't give you a list of like the 20 places, but I think that idea, I think even it comes up in Tanakh, that root as something being about someone who is a mocker or a scorner. And the tarte ma'e, again, I don't think that that's unique to these stories. I think that comes up in other places in the Gemara as sort of like a measurement that is like, even in other places you have it something, not a ma'e, but a pruta, which is another small measurement of currency. But I think that like 2 followed by a small measurement of currency is meant to be like indicating like a throwaway amount. Even like we say in English, like, I'm going to give you my 2 cents. Like, I think there's something about the number 2 and a very small amount, which is to say like money, but it's like, take it for, not really worth anything.
Okay. And I see people are responding. And one question that people had posed was this: who is the Satan, and is it an internal force or an external force? And anyway, I think that was an interesting question. In these stories, who is, it seems like an external force testing these rabbis, as opposed
Right.
to what we think is an inclination is an internal force, unique to each individual. But all these rabbis seem to have the same weakness, and it seems to be external.
Right. That is very interesting. So the Satan is a very interesting character, even in terms of so here's where Satan is, I don't know, speaking about what is Satan in the Jewish imagination versus maybe in Christian theology. Part of what's interesting here is, on the one hand, Satan does seem to be in these stories an external force that is working at odds with God, whereas God would have us be on the right path or acting righteously. Satan is deliberately trying to pull us to some darker side or to the other side, or to get us act inappropriately. On the other hand, Satan is actually respectful of this voice in heaven, right? Satan wants to make Satan's point to say, I could have had you, but ultimately Satan is saying I'm listening to the voice crying out about you in heaven, and Satan is willing to bow down to the voices in heaven and to God. And so that's actually something that's there are stories in which it almost seems like God is, I hesitate to say this, but it's almost as if God can act through the Satan, that God can sometimes Satan and God will really be at odds with each other. And sometimes God will allow Satan to do a certain work in the world if it's ultimately somehow serving God's agenda, or that they can be, in a sense, on a team together, or working sort of cooperatively in the world. And in this text, it almost seems like there's a sense of cooperation, in the sense that, Satan wants to make the point of, don't think that you are above sin. I want to show you that you are not above sin, and you should not be mocking these sinners, but I don't actually want to bring you to sin, because I'm actually respecting sort of the powers that be.
Right.
It's an interesting question whether Satan is external or internal. In this story, I would say, I think you're right, it seems external. And even the idea that Satan, the language of shavke in the Aramaic, the stories, by the way, are in Aramaic, not in Hebrew. Shavke, the Satan leaves him. So on the one hand, it sounds like Satan is this external force. On the other hand, it's an external force that sort of comes inside of us for a certain amount of time, and then can also come outside of us and leave us. And we're also going to see that dynamic in some of the other stories.
And Bimya says, and I noticed this as well, that there's no follow-up to each story. You just see the story, and you don't see the rabbis then realizing what has happened and doing tshuva. So anyway, I thought that was a good point by Bimya.
I think that's an amazing point. I think that is so interesting. Yes, that we see that a moment of that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva would have been so close to sinning themselves, and it's only because the Satan chose to not sort of have his way with them that didn't happen. But yeah, you don't get to see what happens after the fact. How do Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva respond? Do they then change their behavior? How does the behavior change with respect to their own yetzer hara, their own evil inclination? How does it change with respect to not mocking sinners? Actually, is the yetzer hara for Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, is it not only the sexual temptation, sexual inclination, but actually they have a yetzer hara about mocking people? That actually is the yetzer hara for them, that they're drawn to scorn and mock people, and actually that's the thing they need to work on. Yeah, it's really interesting that we don't see that follow-up there. Rochelle, I see that Rochelle wrote that you have to recognize your inclinations in order to retreat from them. That's really cool. That's almost, Rochelle, it's almost like in the story, it feels external, like the Satan leaves and says, I could have had you at this moment. And that's when Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir would have that awareness. But what happens when it's not like an external force? What happens when we're in the middle of being drawn towards something, and maybe we don't even recognize that the path we're going on is not healthy or not good, but we have to have some sort of hard stop so that we can have a moment of awareness, a pause in that rope bridge to then realize, oh, I have to step back from this. This inclination is not good for me. And Rhonda says, each rabbi seems passive not active with respect to the yetzer hara. Okay, amazing. The evil inclination appears to them, and then the evil inclination leaves them. Based on the wording, it doesn't appear that the rabbis actively reject the yetzer hara. So Rhonda, that's very interesting. So in terms of my question I was asking, in terms of how the rabbis are relating, yeah, I think that that's true. On the one hand, they want to be mocking people who are subject to their own yetzer hara, who are uvrei avera. But when it comes to them themselves, they seem to be passive. That is the yetzer hara that's acting upon them. And it's only because the yetzer hara leaves them that they happen to not sin. But they actually, it seems like they would have, if this is a test, they would have failed the test based on this story. So Anita's asking a grammatical question. Mitlotset is reflective, is reflexive. Is that relevant? That's an interesting question. I mean, I don't think it changes the meaning here. It's definitely that he's mocking others, but that is a very interesting question. I think it's a little bit of an interpretive read, meaning to say, I don't think it changes the translation here. I wouldn't change the translation here, but Anita, I do think that it opens it up to a little bit of a midrashic reading that actually, you know, the thing that what's the saying? The thing that you sort of hate most in other people is actually something about yourself, right? You have to turn the mirror on yourself. And I do think, Anita, it's very profound. I think it opens it up to that reading, that it's like they're scorning and mocking others. They're focusing their energy outward, but really they needed to be focusing their energy inward, that it's something, they're seeing the thing that is chaser, that is deficient in other people, but it's actually the thing that is deficient in themselves. That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Okay, just seeing beautiful comments here. I'm not going to be able to call out all of them. Okay, so Toby, this is an important comment. So Toby said, so far this seems sexist, using women as a source of temptation. Yeah, that is true. Yeah, that feels very problematic. I just sort of want to say out, I think that there's a couple of things that are problematic about the series of stories we're going to read. One is, I don't think that these stories are giving enough credit to men, because the stories are always like, men are so weak and vulnerable, and men are falling prey to their sexual inclination, and women don't have this problem. This is like a male problem. So I feel like as a man, I would find some of these stories really problematic. I also think as a woman, I find the stories really problematic that like Satan dresses up as a woman, and then these like men are running after her, and a woman is just sort of like an object or a tool in this lesson. So yes, I totally agree with you. I think that there are some problematic dynamics in these texts, and I think it's important to name them, even though I think that's a context in which these stories were being created. Okay. Okay, and so Michael, I just want to speak to your question. Why are Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva chosen and not other lesser known rabbis? So I think that answer is part of the framing. If it's a lesser known rabbi, you could have dismissed these rabbis and you could have said, oh, well, those are the lesser known rabbis. Those rabbis aren't righteous. They're not particularly holy. They make mistakes. But the fact that it's Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, it means that we can't dismiss these rabbis outright and say, oh, they weren't really such good rabbis. It's like these are, and there are other stories about Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva that we know that they are particularly righteous, learned, pious individuals. And yet even Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, fall prey to thinking that I am above this, right? Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva think about themselves because we are so righteous, we are above this, and therefore we are going to mock other people. So they fall prey to the trap of thinking that they are above a certain level of behavior. And two, we see that they are not above it, that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva sin, just like everyone else, that they would have actually succumbed to the yetzer hara. They sort of got lucky that the yetzer hara chose not to take them. And sort of going back to the meta point that I was making at the beginning, the fact that the other rabbis, that the redactors of the Mishnah and the Talmud chose to include these stories about Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, I think that there's something so impressive. A lot of times when we have role models that we look up to and there are things about them that we don't like, we would rather look away or hide those things because we're embarrassed by them, but that actually the rabbis choose to say, no, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva are very important role models and mentors for us. And also they did these things that are really problematic. And we need to hold both parts of them. That being a moral exemplar in some areas doesn't exempt you from bad behavior and doesn't mean that that's not something that you have to sort of address. So if Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva can fall prey to the yetzer hara, if they can fall prey to thinking, I'm above this, the same thing can happen to us for sure. So I think it's very important that it's those two rabbis. Okay. Feel free to continue that conversation in the chat. So just to sort of summarize, we had that great comment about noticing that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, on the one hand, Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, they're very active in the story and that they are active in being mocking scorners and other people and thinking that they are above the yetzer hara and sin. On the other hand, there's something very passive about them in the story. There's like once the yetzer hara grabs hold of them, they are totally in its traps. And it's only because the yetzer hara decides to leave them that they end up not sinning, but otherwise they absolutely would have fallen prey to the evil inclination. That's Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva. Their own hubris actually is the thing that leads them astray. I want to go now to the first story. Also, this is all right in the same section, the same page on Tractate Kiddushin. Those captive women, again, we're going to have Toby, I'm sorry, more stories about women in ways that I think are quite problematic. Those captive women who were brought to Nehardea were brought up to the house of Rav Amram the Pious, Rav Amram Chasida. So a couple of things, who are these captive women? I think the idea here are these are Jewish women that were taken captive by non-Jewish people, and then they were redeemed, and they are temporarily now sort of in holding at Amram's house in Nehardea. We've redeemed these captive women. We're trying to figure out what to do with them, how to get them back to their families and their people. And so they are temporarily, where should we put these women who are taken captive, who are now dislocated? Let's temporarily have them take refuge in the attic of Rav Amram who? The Pious. That's going to be important. In the same way that those other stories where we're featuring Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, now we are featuring a rabbi who in his very name, we are saying he is a chassid. He is a pious person. He is a person who does kindness and chesed. So these captive women are these women who are in a vulnerable state are being held in the attic of Rav Amram the Pious. They've removed the ladder from before them. The idea is, if you can imagine, it's sort of like a one-story house, and there's a ladder that goes up to the attic, and that's where the women are. We don't want to have the ladder there. The women are up there, the ladder is removed. Why? Not because we're trying to trap the women, but because we're afraid that men with their temptation towards the yetzer hara might climb up the ladder. We want to keep the women safe from these men, even in Amram's house, and so they're removing the ladder. Okay, so now the women are up there. When one of the women sort of passed by the opening of the attic, a light shone in the aperture. This radiance came down. So even though we tried to break the pathway, it's the same thing as like in the other story, there was no ferry. So we tried to take away the ladder, so there was no way to get to the attic. But this light, as soon as the woman passes by, this light falls, and the light is the thing that sort of reconnects the attic down below. One of them passed by, a light shone in the aperture. Out of his desire for her, Rav Amram grabbed a ladder that 10 together could not lift. He lifted it on his own and he began climbing. We thought that the reason why they took away the ladder was because of like whoever the other riffraff are that are running around Rav Avram's house. It turns out it's not the other men that are the problem at all. It's actually Rav Amram himself, the chassid, when he sees the light fall, he's so overcome by his own yetzer hara, by the evil inclination, he grabs a ladder that 10 people, he's sort of has this overwhelming amount of strength, this incredible display, and he starts climbing up the ladder. Same thing as the rope story, right? He was started to go across the rope, across the river. When he was halfway up the ladder, he strengthened, he raised his voice, and he cried out, "There's a fire in the house of Amram." So this is where the story takes a different turn. If you remember in the other stories, when Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, when they were, same thing, halfway across a rope bridge, what happened? Satan left them, and then they no longer had the evil inclination. And then Satan said, "I could have had you, but I chose not to." Here, it's different. Here, it's coming from Rav Amram, that he's halfway up the ladder. He strengthens in some way, And then he shouts out, there's a fire in the house of Amram. Why does he shout out there's a fire in the house of Amram? So that everyone comes running, right? If I say fire, then everyone's going to come to help with the fire. Also, I think there's a double entendre here that he's saying there's a fire, so everyone comes running, presumably to interrupt him in what he's doing, but also there is the fire that is the yetzer hara, the burning evil inclination inside of him. It's like there's a fire inside himself. There's also the fire that is the light that is falling from the woman. There's something going on with fire and light in this story here. So he stops halfway on the ladder, right? He does something very active. This is not a passive story. He does something active. Somehow he stops himself and said, there's a fire in the house of Amram. Upon hearing this, the sages came and they said to him, you have embarrassed us. They catch him in the act. He's halfway up the ladder and they know what he means to do. And so they scorn him. They say, you have embarrassed us. And Rav Amram says, it is better that you be shamed in Amram's house in this world and not be ashamed of him in the world to come. He says, better that you be ashamed of me now before I committed this evil act than I commit the evil act, and you would have to be ashamed of me, not only in this world, but also in the world to come, right? In a sense, they say this thing that is so scathing to him. They say, we know what you were up to. You should be ashamed of yourself. And he says, better that I be ashamed of myself now than had I actually come to do this thing. And then I really would have had to have been ashamed of myself. He took an oath that the yetzer hara should emerge from him. So again, this is sort of similar to the language of that in the other stories that the yetzer hara left him. Ari, this goes back to the question of, is the yetzer hara external or internal? He takes an oath that the yetzer hara should emerge from him. It's inside of him. And an apparition similar to a pillar of fire, amuda de nora, emerged from him. So successfully, whereas in the other story, the Satan chooses to leave, in this story, he actually manages to do something to force the yetzer hara out of him so that he's able to look his own yetzer hara sort of in the face, in the pillar of fire. And he says to the yetzer hara, he says to this pillar of burning fire, remember he says, there's a fire in the house. He says to it, see, as you are fire and I am flesh, and yet still I am superior to you. End of story. So this story, I think, is a particularly interesting story. I think it's weaving together a couple of things. On one hand, I think that there's an incredible Rav Amram exhibits an incredible amount of humility in this story, and also willingness to be ashamed and to shave himself for the sake of stopping himself from doing something wrong. Like Rav Amram could have just kept on going up the ladder, gone and, again, what a problematic story that we're telling here, but he could have just gone up the ladder and done whatever sin he was on his way to do. But actually he manages to stop himself. But the way that he stops himself means that everyone's going to know what he was doing. And he's willing to take that risk. He's willing to risk admitting that he was on his way to sin. He's willing to admit that he was suffering with his yetzer hara and he was not on his way to winning it in order to stop himself. So I think that this is a story that's showing a lot of humility. And I think it's also a story in which he's really asking for help. It's like the way it's not just that he strengthened himself, stopped halfway on the ladder, and then he was done, because the yetzer hara was still inside of him at that point. The thing that allowed him to get the yetzer hara outside of himself is he needed all of the other people to come and see him. And so there's a sense, on the one hand, when they come, they're very accusatory. They say, you've shamed us, you've embarrassed yourself. But actually, there's a sense in which Rav Amram is asking for help, that he finds that he's on this path to doing something that he doesn't want to do, something that he knows is not right. And he, A, is willing to admit that he is at fault, and B, he's willing to ask for help. And it's that willingness to confront the thing he is potentially doing wrong and to ask for help. That's the thing that gives him the strength to then pull the yetzer hara out. On the other hand, this story is a story, I think, really about humility and asking for help. He exhibits this amazing amount of confidence at the end of it. He doesn't then at the end leave the story feeling like, sort of sad and defeated. He instead says very strongly, he finds this place of strength in the stories. He says, see, as you are fire and I am flesh, yet still I am superior to you. So on one hand, he recognizes that he, like anyone else, is flawed and with fault and needs help and has to be humility, has to be humble, right? He's not like Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, who laugh in the face of the other sinners. He sort of lowers himself. And on the other hand, in his willingness to be humble and in his willingness to admit that he needs help, he finds a strength and a confidence in himself to say, I am better than this. I can beat this. You will not rule me. I will find a way to rule you. You are just fire. You are fire and I am flesh. You could consume me, and yet still I actually have power over you. You're not going to have the power over me. Okay, let me pause there. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this story, either in terms of how you're seeing this story in relationship to the other story, or what you feel this story is teaching us. What is this story teaching us about the yetzer hara? And again, when I say yetzer hara, I mean not only in terms of sexual temptation, but in terms of anything that can lead us down a path that we ourselves don't want to go on. And again, just noting how interesting that it's Rav Amram the Hasidah. Again, it's like this is happening to one of the most righteous rabbis. That is the rabbi that we want to tell this story about, that even Rav Amram. Okay, I'm officially going to go to the chat. Ari, again, as always, if you have any thoughts, please feel free to jump in.
Right. So while people are chatting and answers the question, I saw some notes come to me. One was, this story is different than the other two in that the other two, the rabbi is being punished for being haughty, but we don't see that introduction here with Rav Amram. It just goes into the story. He's not making fun of other people.
Right.
So that was one note that, just see, it's obvious, but it means the stories are different. And then the question is, why are these three stories where they are in the Talmud and in Kiddushin? But maybe we'll get there after we see how the people answer
That's always
your question to them.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's always a good question in terms of like to have the greater context of why stories are somewhere. This is actually a lot of times when you see stories in the Gemara, they have nothing to do with the tractate that they're in. It's like really would be such a tangled web to try to trace back the Talmud as a body of work is very sort of train of consciousness and thought. And so oftentimes you would have to trace it back so often it has nothing to do with theme. This is actually one in where it's not so crazy. That's like Kiddushin is talking all about marriage and relationships and intimacy. And so you could see that fidelity could be, and temptation could be a part of it. So in this section, there's like a longer series of agadaot that's all talking about temptation in different ways, and also talking about seclusion of men and women not necessarily being alone together before or after marriage. So this is not a sort of a crazy jump of where this is located. I do think I saw Edwards. So yes, I think that's so interesting, Ari, the point that you brought up, that it's not just about how a person reacts in the moment in which they are sinning, which in this case, Rav Amram manages to actually stop himself, which is so incredible how hard it is to do that, to catch ourselves and to have the self-awareness in the moment that we are doing something that's harmful to ourselves. So that is really striking that he does that. But so I think the story is saying it's not only about how we respond in the moment, but actually it might be our frame of mind even before we start sinning. That part of maybe what it's teaching us is Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva were not able to stop themselves. It only was because the Satan left them. They couldn't stop themselves because from the get-go, they weren't in the right mentality. From the get-go, they were entering into that with a mentality of, I don't need help. I'm above this. I'm not someone that's going to sin. Whereas we don't have that same intro to Rav Amram. Perhaps as it is, he is a person, perhaps his piousness comes from a place of humility, and someone who is humble by nature will be more willing to say when they need help and then get the help that they need. I saw Edward's comment. That's why Rav Amram was called the pious, unlike the other two rabbis. So Edward, it would actually be very interesting to hear, why do you think Rav Amram is called pious? Is it about, and Edward, I'm not sure in which direction you meant by your comment, is Rav Amram the pious because he manages to stop himself in a way that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva do not? Or actually, is he pious because he had the humility to allow himself to be embarrassed and to ask for help is that actually the source of his piety? Not that he was able to stop himself, but that he knew to ask for help when he needed it, even if it risked being embarrassed. Ruth, I see your hand up. Please feel free if you can unmute, or I can help you unmute.
Okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to consider what the actual nature of the yetzer hara is, in that the yetzer hara itself in these stories is the source of the power to curb the yetzer hara. In other words, the thing that takes away the what we call evil inclination is not some innate goodness in these stories, but it is the inclination itself. The inclination itself leaves the sinner. So I wonder what that tells us about the nature of the yetzer hara.
Ruth, that's a very interesting. Do you have a thought on what that tells us about it? That's a very interesting point to make.
I'm trying to remember something that I have forgotten. Was hoping maybe somebody else. Once in a Torah study, a man told me a much more positive sort of translation or interpretation of the yetzer hara, that it is a certain form of strength within itself, depending on how we deal with it.
Right.
I don't remember exactly what he said, and I've been trying to for a long time.
Well, I might have the text that you're thinking about, not on me, but I can try to find it and send it to Ari. There is a midrash, an interpretive tradition that talks about the yetzer hara as saying that the yetzer hara can be both good and can be both bad. That it can be both bad in all the ways that we know that a yetzer hara can be destructive. But then it says the yetzer hara is actually good, because without the yetzer hara, there would be no, there might be no procreation. There would be no next generation, because we actually need some amount of the yetzer hara to procreate. That without the yetzer hara, there would be no building and creation, because we actually need a little bit of the hubris of the yetzer hara in order to propel us forward to build. And so part of what that midrash is saying is like the yetzer hara, meaning sort of like this desire potentially to conquer or to create an imprint on the world, or like that you need a certain amount of that channeled into a way that is appropriate, that actually the yetzer hara does keep the world going and also can be destructive. So that's part of, Ruth, what I was thinking of when you were saying that. Yeah, so I wonder about that. These texts are saying not that we need to hide from our yetzer hara or ignore our yetzer hara or pretend that they don't exist. That's not helpful. Pretending that they don't exist, that's not going to get us anywhere. Actually, what helps Rav Amram in this story is that he acknowledges the yetzer hara. He actually calls it out. He says, there's a fire. I'm dealing with it right now. And by acknowledging it, he's able to confront it and then have this sort of really like dynamic relationship with it.
Yeah, that's like defining courage. And if you say courage means the person was never afraid, then you say, no, that's not courage. If it's not afraid, then there's no big deal in running into battle. Courage is doing it despite the fear.
Yeah.
That's the strength of courage.
I love that. Thank you. Okay.
There's a question whether you think these three stories, and I don't know how many more stories there are in this kind of little section, which would be a question, are these the only three? But if these are the only three, is the Talmud actually criticizing the intellectualism of the first two rabbis who were known to be super intellects versus Rav Amram? And I don't know of Hasidah, I don't know where else he appears in the Talmud, if anywhere else, where he appears to be more of a, I mean, he has the name pious at the end of his name. So is the Talmud kind of criticizing the intellects who are haughty and make fun of the proletariat who aren't, versus the person who is more pious and treats people in a different way, and it's not necessarily an intellect? So I don't know if that is a correct way of separating the stories, because I don't know the stories of Rav Amram.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm not sure if I see these stories as being about critiquing, like, I don't know if I see the distinction as being like people who are particularly, meaning, I don't know if I see the distinction as being about rabbis and scholars who are like leading minds and intellects versus rabbis and scholars who are like leading chesed, kindness doers in the world. Though I think that that is an interesting distinction to make. I don't know that that's a distinction, but I do think for sure it is a comment on, I think it could be about piousness, about there is something lacking in piety in the behavior of Rabbi Meir, not about them being intellectual, but there's something lacking in piety in the behavior of Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva, that they were scorning and mocking other people. You would think that what would I want to see from a rabbi? I would want to see them sort of like reaching out to people who are struggling or sinning or doing wrong and strengthening them, not scorning them, that there is a lack of piety there. And so I think that there is definitely a comment and critique on their behavior, that it's, the moment that we think that, the moment that we think that we ourselves are above sin, that is where we've already gone wrong. And also the moment in which we are sort of pointing the finger at other people instead of reflecting it back on ourselves. Whereas Rav Amram, his piety, I suppose, is his willingness to humble himself. And the last story that I just want to share briefly, we're not going to really see the story inside, so I'm going to tell it a little bit of outside because I just want to give you the ending of the story. There's one more story in this section, and again, I'm just pulling 3 of the stories. There's actually even more stories than this. It's a very rich section. Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, his wife notices that whenever Rabbi Chia bar Ashi would pray, he would fall on his face and he would pray, may God save me from the yetzer hara. And in the story, his wife says, why is he praying about being saved from the yetzer hara, the evil inclination? 1, we're married. What's the yetzer hara there? And 2, we haven't slept together in many, many, many years. He's like, we're not even having a physical relationship. What is he so upset about that he's praying that God saves him from the yetzer hara? So strange story. She goes and she dresses as a well-known prostitute and tries to seduce him. And sure enough, when he sees her dressed as a prostitute, he is seduced by her. And similar to the other stories, she's at the top. She says, bring me a pomegranate from the top of that tree. And he runs up to bring him the pomegranate. And then that is then metaphorically coded as he actually goes and he succeeds to getting to the top of the tree. And he brings the pomegranate. And the Gemara reads that as they consummate their relationship. But remember, he thinks that she is this prostitute. And then here's the end of the story. When he came home, his wife was lighting a fire in the oven, right? Always the fire. Another story about fire. He went and he sat inside of it. She said to him, what is this? He said to her, such and such an incident occurred. He tells her exactly what happened. He's honest. He says, I saw this woman, this prostitute, and I was seduced by her and I had sex with her. And she said to him, it was me. There was no sin. It was me. He paid no attention to her until she gave him signs. She proved that actually she had the same clothing or whatever it was. She showed him that it was her. He said to her, I, in any event, intended to transgress all the days of that righteous man. He would fast until he died by that death. So this is a lot to unpack in the last minute, but one is I want to note that he is so once he thinks he has sinned, and he has to extent sin because he sleeps with this woman that he thinks is not his wife. After this happened, he's so overcome with shame and regret that he gets inside of the oven that his wife is lighting and sits inside the fire, right? He wants to allow himself to be consumed by the fire, whereas Rav Amram calls the fire outside of himself and says, even though you are fire and I am flesh, I will not be defeated by you. In this story, Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, he's so shamed that he sits himself in the fire to allow himself to be consumed. And secondly, that even though his wife says, you didn't do anything wrong, it was me, he refuses to sort of take on the forgiveness of that he fasted for the rest of his life until he died, that he actually allowed the fact that he wasn't able to defeat his yetzer hara, he was so upset about it that he never returned back to his wife, and ultimately he died by that. And so I just would bring this sort of like as a coda with those other stories, whereas I think Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir, the main problem in this story is a lack of humility and their hubris that causes them to sin, and they absolutely would have fallen prey to the Satan had the Satan not stopped him. I think in this story with Rav Amram, it's actually his humility and his willingness to be ashamed that allows himself to stop himself. In this final story, I think this is a story in which actually Rabbi Chia bar Ashi's humility and the shame he feels so consumes him that it actually ends his life. That this is actually a case of the yetzer hara in which the giving into the humility and the giving into the shame is no longer a productive tool of self-awareness, but actually he is so crippled by it that he is unable to go on living, that he dies by this very same death. Okay, I'm going to stop screen sharing there. Obviously, there's more to say, and we have to end because I know you have lives to get back to. But sort of the note that I want to leave you on here with these three very different stories, as Anita says, a good Musar lesson of balance is, yes, I think that part of what we want to take from these stories is on one hand, the importance of having humility around our own faults, being able to have a certain self-awareness, to take a step back and to recognize, to turn the mirror around ourselves, to recognize the ways in which we may be going down the wrong path, and to stop ourselves and to ask for help, to be willing to risk being vulnerable, as Rav Amram does in his story, and the way Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Akiva do not. They're not willing to make themselves vulnerable. But on the other hand, if we go too much in the extreme of Rabbi Chia bar Ashi, if we're too overcome with everything that I do is wrong, I am so overcome by shame that also can be debilitating in a way that is really problematic. Okay, I'm going to pause there.
Well, thank you for the teaching today, part one of our rabbis behaving badly, and bringing it all together in a very nice way for us to understand these texts. Many of us may have seen these texts in different ways, so it's always nice to revisit texts and think about it in new ways, particularly this time of year as we enter. As we are in Elul and entering Rosh Hashanah. What about, so tell us about next week. We're going to be focusing on a different story. It's entitled, We All Make Mistakes.
Right, we're going to be looking at another series of stories in which different rabbis make mistakes. And then the question is, once they've actually done wrong, they've done the thing that they have crossed that line, and we're leaving behind the yetzer hara in next week, but they made a mistake. And the question is, what happens then? What does tshuva look like? Do we welcome them back? Are they able to come back? What does it look like for society when our rabbis and teachers make big mistakes? Are we able to keep learning from them? And what is it like for those people themselves? Are they able to sort of stay in our communities, or is there some process they need to go through?
Great. And I see some questions. I'll be sending everyone who registered a private recording of today's class and the handout, so you'll have it with you. The handout, Gary, is in, I'll put it back here for a second, but it's in the chat. So you can print it out. You should be able to just click on it, print it out. And maybe we'll even send you stuff in advance for next week. If we get the handout, I know Chuck would like to start reading all the text tonight. So let's get him some text. So it'll keep him busy. He won't go up any palm trees or something. You know, we got to give him Jewish text to study. Anyway, thank you everybody for joining us. I hope you remain cool, and I hope we don't have rolling blackouts here in Southern California. If you're on the East Coast, I hope the rain is not too much. We're in a world of crazy. So this is just a moment of calm in the world of crazy to Rabbi Podwall and Dahlia Podwall. You know, we've dedicated this series in your honor, not because Rabbi Podwall that you behaved badly, but because you are a great teacher. You are both very active in our community. It's always nice to honor people with Torah and learning, and you give so much to our community. We're giving this back to you guys. And but you could tell your kids that the rabbi's behaving badly was named after both of you. Then they can have a good laugh. Okay, everybody, nice to see you. Rav Avi, nice to have you back teaching with us, and nice to have our group of learners. Thank you all for your input and your great thoughts. And we have some great sharing. We do, Rav Avi, someone did share in the chat the quote about from Breshit Rabbah 9:7.
Beautiful find. That was very impressive, Marcia. I'm impressed.
Yes,
That was the new
very
draft.
quick. We have good people online here.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody. See you
Bye.
tomorrow. Bye-bye.